I'm very happy to welcome you to this lecture by John Thackara. Many of you are surely already familiar with his work. He's a key figure in contemporary design culture. He's an author, a curator, an educator who has consistently expanded design research and practice through the lenses of social innovation and ecology. These open lectures stems from a collaboration between the Master in Social Ecological Design at the IED Torino and the Circolo del Design. As an institution, we aim to be a place where academic knowledge, research, and experimentation and the voices of relevant thinkers and designers that universities attract or work with can be amplified and enter into dialogue with the broader public and the wider design community, connecting education with the city and its citizens. And in this perspective, the encounter with Michael Kettler and the master program that he's leading has been particularly meaningful, opening up a shared reflection that led to a public program that originates from the master's activities. After today's lecture, in the next month, we will have also two workshops. And the first will be with Vivian Taukman, and it will be in April, and it will be a practical and corporeal investigation into labor materials and ecological relationships in contemporary design. And the second workshop with Gabriel Fontana, that will be in May, will explore the potential of play and sport as spaces for collective imagination and social change. So for both of these workshops, there's still time to sign up, and you can find all the information at the website of the Circolo del Design. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Michael Kettler, and I'd really like to thank him for this collaboration and to thank also, of course, IED to have involved the Circolo del Design in this collaboration with the master. So thank you, Michael.
Oh, sorry, I just lost connection. Can I jump in?
Yes, of course.
We can hear you.
Our internet just completely fell here. Can I quickly introduce John? I missed the last 2 minutes. Okay, sorry about this. Yes, so thank you, Sarah. And just 2-3 words about the Masters, which the Masters of Social Ecological Design.
So
something went wrong?
I think we've lost Michael.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Can everybody hear me? So I could just start, because Michael's going to be sweating somewhere, wherever he is.
Okay.
Here he comes.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see you.
All right, I'll try that one last time. If I lose it, then we just roll, and I'm going to have to restart my computer. So I am one of the co-heads of the Masters of Social Ecological Design, along with Anna Maria Oru, Zeno Franchini, Francesca Gatello, and Adrian Vickery-Hill. And we explore these kind of critical crises in which we're living through a constructive and creative design approach. And John Thackara is our guest faculty. It's a great honor to have him as part of the Masters and also with us today. I lost a little bit of what Sarah said, so if there's any overlap, forgive me. But John is, this big name in the field. I don't really need to introduce him to many, but I will. He's a writer, advisor, event producer, curator. He has written, I think for 30 years now, traveled the world and collected stories, done research. And this morning, I was in a meeting where someone described John as a archive of human innovation. So he collects these interesting ideas, stories from around the world. He is the author of 12 books. I will just mention two briefly. One is The Bubble, Designing in a Complex World, which I read about 10 years ago. It's from 2006, but it was important for me to reframe how I was feeling in relation to the complexity of a world that was speeding up. And instead of trying to reduce complexity, it made me ask different questions, such as, what is technology for? Who is it serving? Why does it matter? I find John's work helps me reframe many of the critical questions that we're facing today. And you find that in his 2016 book, which is mandatory reading in our masters, which is How to Thrive in the Next Economy, which is a hopeful vision in many ways through looking at various examples from around the world of how we are finding ways, given what we have around us, not looking for the new, that also comes up in The Bubble, but rather resourcing through what we have and looking to humans rather than, say, technological change as the only answer, while at the same time, John is quite nuanced in his approach to technology. It's not simply a critique, but rather a contextualization of technology. He's curated many exhibitions. He's directed major institutions and lectured in over 40 countries. He is currently a visiting professor at Tongji University, a senior fellow at the Royal College of Arts, a fellow of Musashino Art University in Japan, and a visiting professor at the Politecnico di Milano, and a guest faculty, as I mentioned, with us. Today, he'll be speaking on the topic of care, value, and place, the new agenda for design. We will talk John will talk for about somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour. And then we would like to open it up to discussion and questions. So please, if you have questions, please write it in the chat on the side, and I will read those out at the end of the lecture. But you're welcome to write them out while he's going, or you can keep your questions to the end. But please feel free to ask those. All right. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for inviting me. And this social ecological design is, a couple of years ago, it was a very new and strange sounding word, but now it seems to capture the spirit of this moment. And so I'm very happy to join this conversation. In case you were wondering, I don't have any magical answers to the question of what social ecological design means. And I know it sounds like a truism, but I think we are all learning about this together. And so that spirit, just to repeat, please put questions or comments or disagreements in the chat, because I hope my comments will be the lead into a good conversation a bit later. So I've called it Care, Value, and Place. And I'm going to focus today on a bunch of examples of what those words might mean. But I do want to start with 5 minutes about the context. Now, can I? Oh, yeah, okay. Some of you may have seen this picture before, but I do think it's always valuable, if only to myself, when talking about design, to zoom backwards in time for a moment to see where our story begins, because I think that when you get immersed in the kind of disagreements or excitement about particular proposals, the bigger picture gets lost. This is my one slide image of the history of the last 10,000 years, which I've used a lot, because it basically describes what has happened to human beings on this planet over that period. So on the left is somebody who might be called a hunter-gatherer and his family, who, to very somewhat oversimplify things, would use 1 unit of energy per person during a day. And go to the right, and there's a human being in London a couple of years ago climbing up a skyscraper. The body on the right hasn't changed dramatically since 10,000 years ago, but what has changed is that guy needs 60 times more energy and resources per person for him to get through the day. And what you see in the back is the city, in this case London, and all the energy and resources that we all regard as necessary and basic needs. And that's basically one of the reasons why we're in difficulties in parts of the world, is because we've made a mistake of thinking that things that are very energy intense are necessary when they maybe not. Just 2 or 3 slides to most of you here won't have even been born when these trends started, but just basically 100 years or so of these upwardly going graphs. This is to do with energy and resource intensity in the economy as a whole, starting in the 1935. And throughout my life as a writer and a curator, I've inherited the works of writers who, from the last kind of 75 years of saying, this cannot go on. Things are growing out of control. We have to really stop growing at such an exponentially growing speed. And my history, your history with other books, is filled with these books that every 5 or 10 years somebody says, we have to change. But mysteriously, we don't change, or that somehow or another, the kind of world that we live in doesn't listen to people like me or maybe you telling it to slow down. The most famous one, I guess, of the kind of slow down books is this one, published in 1972, Limits to Growth, with a scientific book, not so much a polemic, about, and you'll see some of those lines in a moment, all the ways in which the trends as identified in 72 would not be able to be sustained on a finite world. So 20 years of people saying this has got to stop. And then in 93, this is 33 years ago, I came into the picture as an active part of this discussion when I got a job in Amsterdam setting up a new design institute there, the Netherlands Design Institute. And I was introduced to one of the guys who wrote The Limits to Growth, a scientist called Leo Jansen. And I said to this very eminent scientist, yes, tell me we're going to have a new design institute. What should we do about this growth question? He said, well, the first thing you have to know is that the limits to growth is actually much more severe than we said publicly. That although the follow-up book said factor 4, that we have to reduce our use of energy and resources by 4 times, the true number is factor 20. So I spent the best part of all the 33 years since then knowing, as far as this scientist was concerned, he's not an ideological guy, that our kind of overshoot beyond what the planet can actually sustain is much greater than is normally known. And some people have called this the great acceleration. This is the invisible part of the reality that we all inhabit today. So whatever you see at a moment in time in terms of the news or your own experience or your lived experience, all of those different forms of throughputs have been getting bigger, faster, frankly, more or less since the day I was born in kind of 1951. I blame myself. I'm not quite sure what I did wrong, but all these things have been getting faster and faster in a world which is finite. Therefore, it's an impossible situation. And this brings us up to today. Italian professor, so if only those of you in Italy, he's a famous member of the Club of Rome, Ugo Bardi, recently, i.e. yesterday, published an update of these scary charts about just basically things cannot grow on growing to infinity. Therefore, all sorts of strange problems are going to occur. And frankly, they're probably occurring now. So that is why my talk and my work and my life's work has been a search for a different way to organize the way we live on the planet and meet our daily life needs, which is different from everything getting faster and more energy intense every day, which is why this talk is about care, value, and place, and why I think that the one answer that's made sense to me in the last 10 years or so is that caring for each other and caring for places makes far more sense as a basis for organizing our activities and the things we design and the activities we do. It makes far more sense than growth just for its own sake. Now, that notion that healthcare or caring for place is the way that we create value in the future, it's simultaneously impossible for normal sort of economic people or business leaders. They can't deal with it. But at the same time, it makes very obvious sense as actually it's happening already for most of the people in the world. So that's one of the strange stresses of our lives, is that there's nothing controversial about that statement, but it's impossible for the economic system to take it seriously. But if we said that health, the health of people and the health of places is going to be where we more sensibly put our priorities, then the very good news is that healthcare is already a majority of activities that goes on in the world. This is one of the charts about analyzing where government should spend in terms of health services, and it was quite a surprise about 10 years ago when some researchers discovered that in terms of care in industrial countries, non-industrial, rich ones and poor ones, most of the care on a day-to-day basis takes place outside the biomedical system, the system of hospitals and doctors and drugs and surgeries and all of that. That's 5%. Everything else is 95%. And it's just one of the weirdnesses of our world that all of the attention goes to the 5% and not to the 95%. So one way of thinking about my talk today is say, what would happen to design if we shifted our attention from that little green slice, the kind of high-tech, high-value, expensive bit of the care world, and looked instead at the 95% of normal daily life when people look after each other and their places? What would happen if we used our design creativity and passion to attend to that place? So that's basically what this talk is about. And just to conclude my introduction, in case you think it's a bit far-fetched, I'm just describing something which has been common sense for 1,000 years or 2,000 years in bits of culture outside the present game. This is Hippocrates, who some of you may know was the kind of the philosopher of modern medicine, but he said, the health of individuals and communities depends on airs, waters, and places. Not on GDP, not on technology, not on money, but on airs, waters, and places. This is from the Eastern cultures. Lao said, if all things grow well, a society is a community of affluence. Affluence is, richness. You're rich if living things are healthy, then you are in an affluent and successful society. And bringing up to today, common sense is now spreading all over so many parts of the world that we live in. If anybody wants to read up on this question of care from the perspective of somebody who's not a designer, or not me, this is a very good book by an American ecologist, a doctor called D.D. Pershouse. And what she described, I'll just read out these words. Whole of system care is a living, ongoing relationship between practitioner, patient, plants, and landscape. That is, in short, the focus. What I mean is when we turn our attention away from biomedical care or hospital care or doctor care to the systems of daily life, where we live, the places that we grow, and so on. So that sounds and is a bit abstract. So the rest of my talk is going to be examples of that, those words in practice. But I was reminded this morning that the kind of design world, and certainly people like me talking about it, sort of Europe and the United States is at the most 10% of the population of the world. 90% of the population of the world uses different languages, different mindsets, different expectations to talk about where things are going. And so this is I just come back from Central Asia to talk about the subject of caring for places, and there's no territories of life for much of the world in different languages makes more sense than territories of bioregions that we talk about. And so this notion that we have to take care in ways that are unique to each place is something which is very normal in many thousands of other cultures. And if you want those are both publications that you could obtain online as PDFs, very much recommended. But the transition that we're in, and a couple of years ago, this image would have been regarded as controversial. Now I think we're all coming together, old points of view and new ones, science, philosophy, and so on, that the well-being of people and the well-being of places are the same story. So therefore, that's why I said care, value, and place are not separate activities, they're one. So that is our task as designers, is to look at the practical consequences of that, not to have a kind of very abstract discussion, but to say where I live in my place, with my community, where my family are, what practical acts of care are available to me to do right now, to make a difference right now, and not waiting for some future moment. So that is the bit of me which says, what do these words, care, value, and place, mean in practice? I'm going to move on to some food slides. It's a dangerous time of day. What is it? 6 o'clock in France, where I am. People start to get hungry. So I'm just going to risk it. Hope that you stay with me if I talk about food for a few minutes. Because I think the biggest difference between the attitudes and the worldview I'm describing and the one that design came from, the industrial point of view, the kind of global point of view, the GDP point of view, is shifting from the notion that our places, and in particular our farms, are not factories, they're life worlds. And if you think about the places where you are, and it doesn't have to be a romantic looking place like that, it could be a downtown in a very gritty part of a city, there is always life around you if you only choose to look. And if our task is to help life thrive, then it totally transforms the kind of actions that we choose and decide to take. And so the paradigm for agriculture, as well as for many other forms of care, is that caring for a food system in its place. It's not about abstract global solutions or very kind of technologically based solutions, or that can be applied all over the world like a fertilizer out of a packet. It's kind of the opposite of that every single place in the world is different. It's unique, in fact, and therefore it really is a profound challenge to the expectation that as a designer, our task is to look for solutions that can be globalized or scaled up. It's almost the opposite of that, which may at first sound, oh my goodness, I can't be a designer. No, but it means being a designer in a very targeted and unique way from place to place. And so that's kind of the bigger picture, the frame over this subject. In part 2 of my talk, starting now, I wanted to give you some examples of places in the world where it is already happening. Because, I'm an author and I'm a communicator. I've learned rather slowly in my own life that describing how things could be that are just couched in abstract language, people switch off very quickly. And in terms of things like food systems or agriculture, it's very much the case that people say, never mind these words, what is happening on the ground where I live? And the biggest inspiration in the last 5 years to me has been the discovery that in India, which is filled with all sorts of issues and social challenges, is kind of the world headquarters of things getting better in farming. And just to repeat what I said a couple of moments ago, in this movement called the natural farming movement is where the notion of the farm, the land, the territory as a life world has really taken root in the most inspiring way. There are in the farming world generally 1.5 billion small-scale farmers. I'm not describing a minority here. It's a big majority of the people who work in farming, not just in India, work on a small scale, less than 2 hectares. 89% of all the farms in the world are small ones. 80% of all the biodiversity in the world is taken care of in one way or another by small farmers. And that natural farming, sometimes called agroecology, is not just about creating calories to feed people in a very kind of global way, but natural farming is a mixture of activities in a place. It creates jobs, it creates public health, it makes social quality improve. So it's this notion of a life world is not just about a factory churning out food in boxes like a kind of delivery service. It's an ecosystem with all sorts of different kinds of value. And that's why the Andhra Pradesh community managed natural farming is, and this is that Dr. Pershaus again said it again, one of the most important stories of our age anywhere in the world, and not so many people know about it. It's one of my hopes this afternoon, this evening in this talk, that a few of you will be intrigued or even skeptical to go and find out more. But this is my answer to the question, is real farming, is natural farming just an ideal hope which could ever happen? My answer to you is that it's already happening there. So since 2016, I think that number has gone up since I made this slide a couple of weeks ago, but at least 850,000 individual farmers, mainly women, operating in that south of India, have made the transition from some kind of industrial, chemical-dependent farming to the natural kind. They've done this pretty much without being told to do so by outside bodies. There are 231,000 self-help groups have organized. They help each other. These farmers operate kind of at the level of the village, not as individuals, as happens much more in the West and in the North, where it's all about the individual farmer staring at the difficulties of running a farm. It's all about villages. And half the villages have transformed themselves at a village scale, never mind the individual farmers. And I think the most inspiring part of this whole story is that there are 10,000 or more coaches who've come from the ranks of the farmers themselves. They are teaching each other how to do it, how to not just reading books about natural farming, but practicing it on a day-to-day basis. And the whole thing is growing spectacularly because it's not just bottom up, but they take very seriously the notion of how they can help each other learn and improve. And I love this picture because I don't know how many people here today are interested in food systems, but well, many of you, I guess, are in Italy. There's a lot of people have a lot to say about food systems. Many of them are men like me who kind of give lectures and tell everybody how the world should be organized different. In the Andhra Pradesh situation, the men on the left of this picture, who are the politicians or the heads of companies or the experts, have become the students, but in a very happy way, because the women that you see on the right are the ones who are now explaining how this movement has succeeded, how mutual self-help and self-teaching has got off the ground in just a few years. And they're describing to the men not a kind of a scalable solution like something that you get out of a package, but a very social response in which continual learning and experimentation is how they have been successful. So I'm just telling you about it, but I'll end on this slide because I can sum up my whole story in this image, really, which is that the farmers who not just create good food for people to eat, but the way they do it makes the soil healthier, improves biodiversity, improves the quality of the air, reduces the pollution of water, and so on. I think that we should call them the health professionals. And then the perfectly wonderful people down below who we get much more attention to, who are a gigantically big part of the economy, what they do is treat sickness that is caused by unhealthy food, unhealthy water, and unhealthy air. So my provocation is, let's just call them what they are, which is that health professionals at the top and sickness professionals on belief. And if we are all collectively committed to going upstream to look at the causes of things, let's devote our energies and our resources and our support and our solidarity to the health professionals first. Now, practically, what can designers do to help millions upon millions of small farmers who are doing their thing, frankly, without much help from designers or anybody else at the moment? One of the things which I've learned in the last period is that not just in, quote, poor countries like India, but even rich countries, people are getting quite nervous, well, very nervous about something called food security, because all these global supply lines and empty supermarkets and wars and so on, people are realizing that actually the steady supply of food is not so reliable after all. And people are looking again at what, before we had the modern age of global supply chains and strawberries in January, what basic crops did we have and how can we make them more interesting? Many people see these are potatoes in Uzbekistan, which I was there recently. People in rich countries and even people in poor countries who kind of got up the social ladder do not like at the moment to be reminded that they used to rely on basic crops. There's a huge amount of work to be done to say, by the way, there's a reason why these basic crops kept our societies going for so long. They grow easily, they're nutritious, they have a sort of social embedded and so on. And I think it's one of the kind of service design opportunities is to find lots of different ways to, around the world, whatever the basic crops are, finding ways to get the population to say, by the way, we should take them seriously once again. These are sweet potatoes in Uzbekistan, which is one of the places that I've been inspired by recently. People in Uzbekistan think that when they get richer, they don't have to eat these foods anymore. But actually, they're one of the food that grows best in a very damaged environment. And so there's all sorts of activities called, how do we make sweet potatoes more interesting? By what processes can we get people to not be so fixated on importing exotic foods from outside? Chickpeas is another example. This is actually an example from Sweden, where for several years I was involved with a workshop called Back to the Land, where we asked this question: how can we, as creative people, get Swedish people who are used to having exotic imported food all the time, give attention and respect to basic local foods? And this is my favorite image of a hummus made from chickpeas grown near a forest in the middle of Sweden. And there's a big story attached to this, because basically Sweden is the highest amount of, I don't know if there's anybody from Sweden here, you can disagree with me, the highest amount of food imported per person of any country in Europe, suddenly realizing that this makes them very food insecure. And so for the last several years, my friends and colleagues have been looking at ways to create more interest and respect for peas, potatoes, and pulses, things that grow pretty easily, even in the Swedish climate. And my friend Corina Ackner made this hummus out of forest-grown chickpeas to demonstrate that very delicious things could come out of an environment that has actually been neglected for so long. Then, during that process, some historians found out that there used to be thousands upon thousands of what they call forest farmers in Sweden, who until recently had almost completely disappeared. Now people are saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe forest farming is quite an interesting activity. So the design angle is to look for traditions, for places, for chefs, for different kind of, to restaurants, bringing together the components of a story. And it's then mixing together with this incredible shift to plant-based diets. So they're lucky for the forest farmers of Sweden who are going back into that world. There's a radically growing demand for things that look like meat but are made of plants. And this is where the very ancient practice of peas and potato growing combines with the very modern dietary shifts, and you get the possibility of new foods, new restaurant concepts, new forms of dining, and so on. And I wanted to finish off by, I don't know how many of you have any contact with food systems or rural economy, but one of my main arguments today is, as I said a bit earlier, is that a lot of these things are already happening. We do not have to invent these rural economic activities. There are pioneers of one kind or another always already doing it. So this is in the middle of Sweden, and you have around that table, you have a researcher, an artist, a chef, a coffee roaster, somebody from the municipal authority, a dietitian. There's a couple of people you can't see. These very multidisciplinary groups are busy all over the world saying, we have got to kind of put vitality back into the lives. It's not just about asking farmers to grow food without all on their own. Let's see if we can make a multidisciplinary, multifunctional activity of what is a farming community. But it is true, and I'm still on the food question here, it is true that most city people, most people in modern societies have become alienated from the land, from nature, from farming. And when they're alienated, they then can't be solidarity, they can't be part of the process. And a lot of people then say, well, we should have education programs, we should give people lectures, we should show them films, we should do all sorts of things that are basically telling people they should behave differently in relation to food. And one thing I've learned as a communicator is that telling people to change their behavior is pretty much a fool's errand. It doesn't work. People often do the opposite. What does work is to give people the opportunities from early in their life to have new relationships with the people who grow their food. So this is a bit of an introduction to what I think is one of the most inspiring examples in Europe of design people and farming people and food people and teachers and parents collaborating to make it easier for children to have connected to farmers, connected to farms, and so on. It's called the Bio Canteens movement. And it's a kind of social design, service design, a bit of food design, and so on. The story is very simple. In this group of, where it started about 12 years ago, a bunch of schools agreed that they would spend 3 years making sure that all the food that their children eat in 20 schools came from local farms, and that as far as possible it would be bio or organic food. And this then led to a whole variety of activities in which, classrooms had to redesign, the curriculum, the canteen, the teachers had to talk to the parents had to talk to the farmers. So a simple thing about looking at school meals started to reconfigure social relationships and cultural relationships in a very profound way. And this movement is now spreading across Europe, and thousands of schools are now embarking on activities like this. So the design story is not a designer designed the biocanteen, but most of these projects have a design element as well as these other groups of people. So it's a movement which has started, but there are still many thousands of schools that can be involved. A design person can be one of the agents of change in that situation. And you can see that it's become a kind of European priority now. Don't panic about those words on the right. This is a design kind of habit of making diagrams, but I quite like just the number of different things that have to be thought about when a school system, for example, in a town or a region, decides to take on this biocanteens movement. There's lots of things to do. Some of those things involve design, some of them don't. That's the good. That means there's lots of work for lots of people. So I'm leaving this image with you. If you want to get into the biocanteens world, which is food, farmers, and children, it's a rather wonderful world to be in. That diagram gives you a to-do list, which will keep you going for quite a long time. One of the things that, in terms of care, value, and place, that is really challenging to a lot of people is how to deal with very damaging forms of modern life that we would rather weren't there. Tourism is one of them. And as I've said a bit in just talking about the biocanteens, there's really a big problem of the whole food system generally is the isolation that farmers suffer, because they're basically assumed to be like mini factories with one worker per factory, left to do all the things that are required to run a farm on their own in a hostile market without much support or even very little contact with your customers, i.e. the people who eat your food. Is a very, very, it's a very unhealthy system, the modern food systems. But what's happening is that for a long time, agritourism, going to a farm, became, for a small number of enthusiastic people, kind of green people, not rich people, but people who are sort of the pioneers of the food movement, said we should go and stay on farms and camp in a barn and sleep with the sheep to kind of get a feeling of what it's like. That has all changed in the last few years with the explosion of what's called the global wellness economy, because what before was a few pioneers has now become an incredibly large number of people want to spend money on things that are healthy. And I'm not going to go into detail of these things. All you have to look at is the sort of purple ball in the middle there. It says wellness tourism is getting on $800-900 billion. These are people who will spend money to go and to a different place to get healthier. And that includes agritourism, going to farms. And because this is basically describing, the rich people of the world, to be candid, you might think this is an unhealthy place to start. But the point is, when there's lots of money involved, lots of interesting innovations and changes do happen. And one of them, which is completely extraordinary to me, is that there's this notion of high-end luxury regenerative farming has become a trend. This is a place in South Africa called Babylon's Toren, which was a rundown wine farm, and it was not in desperate straits, but it was not an exotic place, just a kind of normal farm. And then some outside people with money came along and said, let's turn it into the best possible agritourism in the world, which is, if you have lots of money, you can do that. And it's a very fascinating story, because what they did was to spend 2 years creating what they now describe as the Versailles of vegetable gardens, which is not a typical agritourism site. I mean, I agree with that. I'm showing you this and mentioning it to you because this is a kind of the opening up of a market where a farm and a farming destination is not just a production unit where, as a visitor, you go and stare from across the fence. The whole thing has been set up as a place to be a participation from the people who go there as well as the people who grow the food. So you can look it up, Babylon's Toren. It's quite an extraordinary enterprise. What I particularly like is that a lot of business, more and more on that farm, when people go there, you can go on a course. You can learn how to do things, everything from leather work to cooking, making chocolate, whatever. Now, again, this is, wealthy people going to have a pleasant day learning how to do a skill. It's not about basic survival skills at all. It's the opposite of that. The point is they are responding to a desire amongst their customers to have a hands-on an embodied relationship with the farm, not just to go there and consume a meal or stay the night, but people more and more want to touch things, to make things. This, in my mind and in my experience, there's nothing to stop ordinary farms offering similar experiences, and they already do to some extent. But as a designer, you could design experiences and courses and practices, not just very, very high end, but of different kinds, so that it provides the diversity of income that many farmers would very badly welcome, which is to say, rather than being suppliers of calories to people they don't know, they could have a farm with these kinds of activities, learning about the land, learning about food, learning about nature. There's a gigantic demand for it, but it's not, at the moment, it's quite hard to get all the different bits together. This maps onto the boom, which I didn't know about until recently, for kind of food tourism. This is honey, which of course is honey. In Slovenia, they've pioneered something called honey tourism or honey routes, where people go for days and days to different locations where people living in little huts in the mountain raise bees and make honey. It's a kind of very successful. This is not so expensive and high-end as the one I showed you before, but it's tourism in which you go in small numbers of people. You go and spend time with a farmer or a honey, beekeeper. You learn stuff, you do hands-on courses, and you leave behind not just money, but some social contact for the beekeeper and so on. If that's true for honey, it can be true for potatoes, it can be true for nuts, it can be true for everything, basically. And indeed, there's the notion of touring to learn about the land, and by being there and by making things is, I think, one of the ways to get close to what sustainable tourism can be. But in terms of this urban rural economy, I wanted to end this bit by emphasizing that there's a lot of injustice and frankly ridiculously unfair behavior in the tourism industry, as you may know. This I got from Le Monde, the French newspaper. They did a survey about so-called agri-tourism. And Jacques, the tourist, pays for, 5 days, $1,200. The local people who do the work, tramping along and providing the food and the accommodation, they get $50 for the 5 days, and the mule that does the most work gets $0. So I would like to suggest that the next generation of agri-tourism and urban-rural interactions, we need to rebalance that number rather dramatically, because that way you're just recreating the inequalities of the city, putting and exporting those to the countryside. How am I doing for time? Anybody got the... Yes, I'm doing fine. I've got another 5 minutes, I think. What I'm describing in this care, value, place scenario is a variety of ways in which people from rural areas and from cities are having new kinds of relationships. And there's a whole gigantic industry out there of policymakers and people from economics ministries or health ministries. They all agree in lots of different ways that, yes, we want rural areas to be healthier. We want city people to have relationships with farmers and so on. But the missing element is it's very often outside people kind of exporting ideas and practices and maybe grants to rural areas. And so it's very much a top-down and outside-in activity. And I think that one of the problems in this whole transition that we're in is that we need to be much more radical in empowering the local people who are already there to be the leaders and the co-owners of these new kinds of projects. So for a number of years, I worked with some friends and colleagues in the south of Italy, particularly around Matera in Basilicata, on a project called the Open School for Village Hosts. This is basically starting from the premise that even when you have what looks like a half-empty village or something with no life, there is always activity and people with potential services and activities and places to offer. But what's missing is somebody to coordinate the activities. So this is a place called Grottoli in Basilicata, not far from Matera. And our researchers, over a period of time, discovered that although it looked half empty and half dead, there are all sorts of people there, cooks, teachers, people making clothes, people who could look after children. There were human resources, if you can use that word. There were buildings, there were tools, traditions of tremendous potential, but realizing the potential was the missing element. And so it was discovered, and we learned over those years, that what you need is somebody from and in the village who's from there to be a kind of host or a coordinator to put these people together and turn them into something which an outsider can relate to. To cut a long story short, we ended up at the end of the first cycle identifying 16 people, mainly women, from those different villages in Basilicata and other places in Europe, who were operating all sorts of activities on their own. They weren't being given money by governments. They were kind of self-employed and self-initiating people, but they had a tremendous amount of experience, and they had the support and trust and appreciation of their local communities. What they did not have was any kind of sense of being supported by outside forces in doing their work. And so we discovered that village hosts are already there, thousands of them in different ways, somebody running a shop or a bed and breakfast or a cafe who does other things. But what's needed is a way to connect them to each other and to connect them to other things, such as money or resources or networks. And so the whole kind of care, value, place ecosystem is very much about coordination between people who are often already there, resources that are already there, but putting them together in such a way that they become a service or an experience that is possible for people to make a living or a livelihood from. I won't go through all those things in any detail because I wanted to keep moving. So that's village house. Fiber is another aspect of care, value, and place, which has a very ancient historical legacy, which has for a long time been fragmented by the global fashion system. So this is a fiber shed which began in America and is basically a group of people who were in Northern California were shocked to discover that something like 3 million sheep fleeces were being exported or thrown away every year because the sheep were only used basically for the meat, and there was no way of using the actual wool because there was no kind of infrastructure for it. And so in the last 16 or 17 years, they've invented a kind of regional economy in which the elements of a fiber economy are connected together again: local fiber, local dye, local labor, as it says here. And that's, to me, the most advanced and the most significant of the experiments of the last 10 years is the fiber economy. As it says here, a landscape that defines and gives boundaries to a natural textile resource. What they did was, in Northern California and now in 60-something countries, is to do a kind of audit or an investigation or a map saying what elements of the economy for fiber are here and what are we missing, and then to fill in the missing gaps becomes the innovation or the business development that needs to be done. And there you see on the left, in a Northern Californian context, the different activities and livelihoods that can be supported by a healthy fiber economy: farmers, knitters, weavers, designers, and so on. The point is that many of those people already there, some of them not yet, but when the system works as an ecosystem, then a lot of new livelihoods and jobs are created because it's a kind of new economy with existing resources. The missing element, and the bit I think we can talk about in the discussion, is how do these things put themselves together? How does a local fiber economy emerge when it's basically a kind of global economy of very kind of fragmented and disconnected people? I think it's a good question. The interesting thing is that people are beginning to reframe the whole subject. So it's not just about fiber economy, it's not just about making clothes with the wool of sheep. It's also about looking after the landscape so that people who are graziers or shepherds also can be expert on the health of the land. This is a book which I recommend called Training the Next Generation of Graziers as Ecological Doctors. People moving across the landscape with sheep and goats have a lot more knowledge about the land than people sitting in an office or in some remote studio or looking through a satellite image. We need to empower and enable people in the shepherding and pastoral businesses to be part of the land care system. I particularly like the discovery that the sheep themselves can be a kind of a sensor, because it turns out that animals, of course, have a much more intense and subtle understanding of their environment than humans often do. The sheep is part of the land. Big subject, which I won't go into now, but making animals and humans together as part of the stewardship of land and finding an economic model to make that work is an incredible opportunity, because amongst other things, something like 40% of the land in the world is not suitable for normal farming, but is suitable for grazing. So we're talking about a lot of the Earth's surface. And you're probably more familiar as designers with the ways in which natural materials can be used for lots of different purposes. And the flax movement is where very hardy and easy to grow crops, new uses. I particularly like this picture because this is the Pennsylvania fiber shed, and they've basically discovered that they need to send their members back into universities and design schools and fashion schools to educate the students about flax, because the normal education just doesn't even, at the moment, doesn't have the capacity or the imagination to teach people about where their materials come from. So being a fiber shed or a fiber economy, you end up being a design school as well. And I'm going to just move on here. And it just loops back into this notion of agritourism, because there's so much potential for people in small numbers to learn about lands that have been ignored, to learn that deserts are not empty, that wastelands are filled with value, and that there are cultures and traditions that really have a tremendous quality and value to them that you don't know about until you get out there and become part of that culture, even if on a part-time basis. I think it's 6:30. Michael, are you there? Michael?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think, have I been talking for an hour and a half or no? I've been.
No. Keep going, please. Take your time.
Okay.
We're good.
I can keep. When do we have the questions? Shall I go for another 10 minutes? Is that okay?
Absolutely. 10, 15 minutes is fine.
Okay. Because I lost track of the time. Okay, here we go. So, to recap about my story, this notion of care, value, and place is finding ways to connect with people and places and ecosystems and traditions and cultures that are already there, but we become separated. And very often when people like me give this talk about back to the land or looking for traditions, it's assumed that we are setting ourselves in opposition to technology, and that this is a kind of binary thing. Michael was kind enough at the beginning to say I'm nuanced about it. The nuance that I have is basically 100% from learning from farmers and people living in rural situations over many years, that they are not anti-tech. What they are anti is people trying to foist technological solutions on them that are not appropriate to their situation. So for anybody who's listening, who's a design person with an interest in technology, who has a kind of feeling that the rural situation or natural farming or caring for the land, that there are technological parts of that story, you're completely right. But at the same time, be aware that the people who know best what kind of tools are needed are not people like me sitting outside, and maybe not you if you're living in a city, but you need to be in direct touch with the people who are working on and with the land. And the people who are on the land, they're very keen to use, for example, the internet and modern communication networks as part of their lives, but maybe the applications are different to the ones that you would expect. So man's internet and nature's internet are regarded as automatically connected if you're a shepherd or a farmer in most parts of the world. What they are not happy about is when somebody comes along with a very complicated and expensive and possibly damaging solution that they had nothing to do with creating. So this is by way of an introduction that anybody here who's interested in technology for transition and the nature and farming, there are now movements and platforms and groups discussing this exact question of what technologies do they need in order to meet their needs as practitioners and stewards of different and highly diverse rural contexts. So this is a picture from something called the Grassroots Innovation Assembly, which has now met, I think, 3 times in the last 4 years. This is, now not many people know about this unless you're in it, in which 1.5 billion farmers probably know about it, but people in the design world generally not. This is one way into this whole world if you want to use your skills as a technology designer or as a designer generally. Talk to these guys who are the grassroots movements for small farmers around the world. Find out from them how much progress they've made in identifying needs that are not yet being met. And it's a very large number of very interesting opportunities for design and innovation. But please be so kind as to talk to them before you sit in your studio and design a robot for making weeds or planting seeds. I'm just going to jump over that, because one of the things that brings this to life for me is this picture where many people are trying to get cities to be more proactive in having compost and or processing their organic waste and feeding the soil with organic healthy things. But it's very practically difficult in many cities. But the farm hack movement have collaborated in various cities with different municipal authorities on what kind of tools could they develop to make municipal compost heaps more efficient and easy to manage. And I'm not going to go into the details. What you see on the right is temperature gauges that measure the temperature inside a big heap of organic matter. And somebody sitting somewhere else, for example, in the building at the back, could be told by the remote sensor that something was getting too hot or too cold, pile of organic matter. Then they could come down from their office and turn it over. This is just a small but a rather charming example of how technology has a very useful role to play if, and frankly only if, the users of the technology have designed it or been part of the design, not if something that somebody dreamed up in their head. And those examples down the left of the screen there are people and organizations that you can connect with if you'd like to know what on the to-do list is ready to be done. But I wanted to sort of have a kind of contrast between two things. One is, yes, we need technology. Yes, we need new business models. Yes, we need direct connections between people in farms and people in schools. But the sort of over the whole picture, what's needed is for everybody who is involved with care and land and place to, in one way or another, not have to think too hard about why it's important. I'm trying to say we need to have a natural feeling of connection with the land and with natural systems, not have to be told about it or reminded all the time. And that is another way of saying we need a cultural connection and not just a practical one. And this brings me to one of the most inspiring projects that I've come across in recent times, which is the Findhorn watershed in the north of Scotland. So all over the world, there are landscapes and pieces of countryside or bits of cities in which rivers have been damaged or concreted over, or farming has damaged the purity of the water, or the wrong trees have been planted, or we all know many of these problems. In Findhorn, a trust, an organization, a kind of group of different organizations came together to be a watershed trust, said we need to rethink our work. And what they've done is to say, if we want to bring the watershed back to life from the height of the mountains down to the sea, it's only will happen if different organizations and individuals collaborate together, landowners, farmers, ecologists, scientists, government officials, agricultural dealers, and so on. It looks like empty landscape, but there's so many people have a possible interest in how it's looked after that it cannot be done piecemeal. It needs to be seen as a whole social ecological system of what you heard about at the beginning, that the social side of it and the ecological side and the economic side, they're not separate things. Well, they have become separated in our modern world, which is why we have so many problems, but we need a social ecological approach. And in Findhorn, what they've done is to create a three-pronged or a three-channel activity over the next 1 or 2 generations, which combines things which for the most part in the world are separate. So on the left, you have nature recovery, physically improving the condition of rivers or fields or forests. That is a traditional ecological restoration. In the middle, you have something called nature connection, which is connecting people with the land, with nature, with living things who otherwise might be separated by modern life, by living in a city. And on the right is the economic dimension. You cannot ask people to be connected to nature or be part of restoration if they don't have a job and cannot feed their children or pay their rent. So creating economic opportunities is the third part of one single story. So what they do is different activities, not a very big organization, but in different ways, they look for ways for one of these three things to feed on each other. And so citizens get involved in collecting seeds and things of that kind. But the bit that most moved me is the cultural side. And I don't know if you've heard of or used the language of intangible cultural heritage. The Findhorn Trust decided that they needed to have a better understanding of what the kind of historical, cultural connections between people were in this land and the watershed. So they hired two ecologists, human ecologists, to do a study of all the different ways in which, through poetry, through song, through craft, through art, through food, people felt a connection with the land and the watersheds of the land. And after 2 years of this work, this body of knowledge was brought together in a rather wonderful series of documentations, but also in a concert. So they ended up creating a performance, which is about 2 years ago, Songs and Stories of Our River, in which people in that room, there was 400 people, landowners, people running businesses, government officials, students, parents, and so on. Very diverse people in the room, but they all suddenly realized that the shared interest and shared love of their place and their watershed, as expressed by the music and the poetry and so on, that is where the notion of culture as vital infrastructure, it's not just an extra, I think becomes part of the story I'm telling you today, that one needs to give as much priority to cultural connection, cultural mending, as to the physical restoration or the economic restoration of the land. And I'll now I'll sort of pull it together, because I don't know if you're all from how the geographically distributed everybody here is today, but my own work, I'm quite, since 6 or 7 years, been working with colleagues in China on a program called Design Harvests, which brings many of these themes together. And if you wanted to sort of say, well, how can, I don't know, the city of Turin or your design school or your company, how could it get involved in this such a diverse series of activities? What we're trying to do in this program in Shanghai is have a kind of platform that loosely connects those different strands that I've been talking about. So way back in 2013, my colleagues started work on the island of Chongqing, going into the countryside and doing workshops. And many people here today, I'm sure, have done this. Talking to farmers, talking to growers, finding ways to restore the land. But in general, the difficulty and the frustration was that it was always like a one-off excursion into the countryside. It wasn't an ongoing activity. And so since that period, there have been various sort of iterations of the design harvest model, always looking for an answer to the question, how can we do this on an ongoing basis? How can designers be part of rural or urban-rural development, not just for a project for a week or two, but on a continuous basis? And the first phase of that work was to be quite serious about making a kind of map of who is already out there. You can't see this in detail, but this is in Chongqing Island, all sorts, everybody from duck breeders to farmers to pig breeders and so on. The design team made this quite a sort of thorough map of people who are already there, but for the most part were just disconnected from each other and not dealing with each other in the sense of an ecosystem that was connected. And many of these people that they discovered had links with the city, but individual links. So they weren't kind of systematically connected to the city. It was all very fragmented, not unhealthy, but fragmented. And then to phase two is that an opportunity arose to, not far away, in a different location, to have a different approach than just seeing what was already there, but to look at the historical legacy for, in this case, a canal district of Shanghai on the edge of the city. And the starting point for phase two of Design Harvest was what used to be here before the modern age, what were the kind of economic activities, what was the state of the rivers and the canals, what did the farmers do, what did the fishers do, what did the city people do, in order to understand that before you had the infrastructure of modernity, what could the land support then? And what you see on the right is when it's kind of fallen into disrepair. But the question is, what can be sensibly regained from the past, combine it with the inventions and the tools and the infrastructures of the present and the future to make something quite new? And that's where, when you start to look outside the traditional kind of model of urban development, you find yourself talking to scientists who have a deep knowledge of organisms that clean up polluted water, hyperaccumulators. It's a very specialized bit of science, but it's quite remarkable and magic. But those people, the scientists of hyperaccumulators or bioremediation, for the most part, don't talk to design people or city people or anybody else. They do their stuff in their laboratory. So the Design Harvest project was, how do we get the scientists who can tell us how to use plants to clean up water, to talk to the urban planners, to talk to the builders, to talk to the people opening houses. The Design Harvest then said, well, by the way, should we not check by what other people are doing? And this is where, but as a foreigner, but it just completely blew my mind to discover that elsewhere than in that particular area, that different bits of the system had undertaken 4,300 wetland restoration projects, quite amazing. And the happy making thing about it was that they didn't know about each other either. They were kind of, there's a sort of generalized desire to restore wetlands, but not something, they weren't all connected to each other. And so we were able to collect as a Design Harvest team examples, very fragmented, of all the different things that people were doing, not just ecological restoration, but what you see on the right is work and livelihoods that people were doing. And again, I want to stop in a minute, but that whole experience showed to me that there's just such a variety of work and jobs out there from pioneers. And the design challenge and the question for me is, how do we make that less fragmented? How can we make it more central to the way we think about development? Farms, teaching farms, jobs I just showed you about, live streaming, using technology to connect farmers to the city. It's becoming a rather mass thing. 300 million farmers in China now get involved in one way or another in live streaming. But it's been a kind of emerged from the technical infrastructure, not from a design point of view. So this is, again, a very rich source of potential. I think I'll stop on this picture because my favorite example, that we found a chicken farmer living in a fairly distant province who was a chicken farmer. What can I say? He sold chickens and eggs, but he had some sort of natural talent for making films about his chickens and his eggs. Has now become got 20 million followers, got a rather kind of successful business. People buy the chickens or the eggs or both from the city. He has a relationship with not just with his chickens, but with his customers that simply wasn't there before. Connections that were designed by designers, enabled by a tech company, but the actual fundamentals of a farmer in a rural situation haven't changed so much. So that's the example of care, value, and place. It's happening everywhere. It's not something that we have to kind of create from scratch, but there's just a lot of variety in the ways it can be implemented. So I'm going to pause at that moment because I don't know what's happening in the chat. I haven't been able to look, but that's what I think is inspires me at the moment, and I think there's a tremendous amount of potential.
Thank you, John. That's a great panorama across the world. Wonderful examples. So now I will hand it over to the public. So please type in your questions. While you're doing that, I'll just open up kind of a general question, a very practical question. There's something really beautiful in the way that you've concretized, you moved from, I should say, from this, these abstract crises, to something that's actionable. And with that action, you're also saying it's not just doing something, but it's being attentive. It's being in tune with these places and the needs of the people. But for many of us, we've kind of been trained not to be attuned to our surroundings, to what's happening. What are the everyday practices that can kind of guide us back into seeing, the care, the place, the value? Like, how can we start seeing that, which in many ways remains invisible to us?
Well, the simple answer, Michael, the high-tech solution to your research question is called taking a walk. I don't know how many people here today have been on walks around their neighborhood or their territory or their region, but a lot of people are starting to do that. It's quite a magical, it does two magical qualities to it. One is if you walk along by a field with a farmer, you learn more about that field in 2 hours than in a year of studying it online. But the other thing is, if you do it in a group, then walking across that field or along the street, you talk to your other people who share your interest in what's happening, and you can just chat to them. My friends in England at the Bioregional Learning Centre have made almost an art out of learning walks, and it's just really quite remarkable how many people from very, very diverse backgrounds find that they have things in common to somebody when they're walking across a field or across a moor. And so I kind of rather strongly recommend that taking a walk is a good first step. And it doesn't have to be in some nature, it can be just down the street where you live. If you could find somebody who knows about plants or microorganisms or whatever, public health, get somebody with a bit of expert knowledge to come along, and they will then guide your attention to all sorts of things. So within 500 meters of where you're standing, I pretty much guarantee you can find interesting things that could maybe be improved or changed.
Okay, nice. I firmly believe in walking. Still waiting for some of these from the public to finish typing their messages. So I'll follow up with the second question, a little bit more of a critical question. Value, place, and care. Nice words, but there's also an inherent tension. And one of them is how value, once we start seeing value in something, there's also a tendency for one type of value to kind of cannibalize the other values. And that value is it's monetary value. And I'm thinking of a specific example in Burkina Faso with the karité tree, where it was, this central tree for hundreds of years to various communities, and they lived off of it. It was central to various rituals and ceremonies. And then when there was that realization that there was also this, quite lucrative financial value, that took over, and it cannibalized all of the others to the extent where they lost the care, they lost the place because there was too much value. It fell out of balance. So, I mean, how do you juggle that when there is a very real risk?
I juggled it, and I've been struggling with it, and stressed by it my whole life, unlike many people I'm sure here, because it's quite true that money has come to have a power to attract attention and effort and resources in a way that love for one's place does not. So I don't at all have a simple answer to your question, except that it's a very important one. What I can do, what I have said a bit this evening, is that where you have communities of people who are not distracted by money at the expense of all else, they tend to be working collaboratively. They tend to be in villages and communities. It's not individuals who are very morally strong, so I don't need money. But for example, the women in Andhra Pradesh, those farmers, they have been able to be partially autonomous from the global food system by being village organized and say, look, our village, we need food, we need education, we need lots of things. We don't have to buy all those with money. We can provide many of them ourselves. And you get a kind of a commons or collaborative economy on a local scale that meets basic needs. I think I think the mistake a lot of us made was to say money is evil, or the growth economy is killing the planet, and basically wagging our fingers in different ways. But people say, yeah, all right, but I've got to live, I've got to feed my children. What am I supposed to do? I think we have to meet people in their at the daily life level, and then say, can we meet these needs other than by having money? Because if we can do that, then there are other qualities and things that maybe could actually improve the positive experience.
Okay. Yeah, it's a difficult question. I have a question here from Agathe de la Poipe. She says, thank you so much, John. I'd like to ask you about the harvest design context you mentioned, especially related to China, where large development, real estate, for example, puts in peril such grassroots initiatives, and where one would assume the smaller project has less weight in the eyes of the government. What have you come across where the smaller project was able to stand its ground? What conditions are most helpful to push back against this kind of land grabbing? So, nice question.
A great question, and please, it's a very important reality check, because it's so easy for people like me to sort of, what a marvelous stories where everything was effort. What I know about China is that there's a lot of small projects that have not survived by being strong, but by they've managed to create alliances and collaborations with local authorities and municipal governments. So lots of farming projects or urban farms or urban gardening projects, not just in China but around the world, municipal governments kind of realize that there's many positive aspects to these projects that they might not have known a few years ago. And so for anybody in any situation, my advice is, or my request is, try to have a conversation with local government people as soon as possible, because although very often we think that they're against it, or they're kind of owned by property developers, it's not always true. But you do need to do some research to find out who are the individuals who might be sympathetic. And the other thing is that it's what you're describing is completely true. For most of my life, quote, property developers have been the enemy. But that is really changing also in quite a kind of meaningful way for two reasons. One is that the global property kind of boom is kind of coming to an end in terms of for various reasons. And there are developers out there who have discovered that, lo and behold, having green things near their developments actually helps them to sell them. So in Berlin, in Germany, for example, if you build a block of flats or convert some apartment buildings, they will actually have a better value if they're near an urban farm than if not. And also in many places in the south of India, in Bangalore, for example, big bad property developers are now voluntarily digging wells to reach out to take the rainwater from the top of the house into the groundwater, because their tenants and their citizens want it. And so I don't want to exaggerate it, it's still very, very tough in any kind of development kind of hotspot, but the development system, I think, is responding to 20 or 30 years of pressure and or positive incentives from the fact that people actually actively want to be near living systems, and they want the living systems to be healthy. So it's not going to answer all your questions, but I don't make assumptions about who the enemy is, maybe one way to summarize.
Okay, some more questions for you. From Mariana Sopper. Thanks, John. Increasingly, we are finding ourselves in a multicultural and globalized world where people I lost you the message, where people grow up across different spaces and locations and across different traditions. When people's communities are fragmented across space, how do we refocus and engage on a physical place?
A lovely question. I think that the mobility across places and being hospitable and being welcoming to strangers used to be a very normal part of many cultures, and then it kind of got lost or fragmented by whatever developments in the world. As I said, I was in Uzbekistan. I don't normally fly off to such distant places, but it was amazing to me to meet people who study and write about nomadic cultures, to explain the deep roots that nomadic cultures have in how they would organize. If you would turn up with a flock of sheep, who has the rights to what can they eat, where can they drink, where do you stay, where do you get something to eat? And this is a kind of practical questions that have been answered over centuries, many of which have, but not all, have been lost. And they have in particular different traditions of shared meals that are very, technically formal ways in which strangers can get to know each other around a shared meal, which is not a new concept. Food is, as I said at the beginning, very powerful. For the death to harm, there's a word in the Uzbek culture for how people coming into your tent village or your small community, you have a duty of hospitality and conviviality. There's a shared meal, which in terms of creating respect and hospitality is part of the culture. So to slightly oversimplify, we need to reinvent those rituals and the physical aspects of those rituals for hospitality, so that we can actually have something practical to do when making it easy for people to connect with places that they might otherwise be separated from.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Bruno Ferreira. Dear Professor Thackara, it's becoming more and more common to see within the field of design, with this intersection to anthropology and digital technologies, a discourse of a more than human design or a multi-natural design. How do you see this idea relate to your premises of value, care, and place as a new agenda for design? Do you see design as a practice beyond the human, or it's still something still restricted to a theoretical realm?
Well, it's a great question. I can answer slightly directly, because I am one of the many people who've been reading these words, more than human design, or for the last years, and people reading the great writers and the philosophers who've educated people like me about it's not just about humans. And I'd be part of a sort of, like a student like everybody else. And I say, yes, that makes sense. But I've assumed it was a kind of cultural kind of myth, a nice one, but something not practical. But what is quite amazing to me is how many very kind of hard-nosed practical people are now using the same language, i.e. urban planners or property developers. So I'll give you another, the example in another Indian city that they were talking about water systems and how can you persuade people who build buildings to take the more than human aspects into account. I mean, they have rather imperfectly, applied laws and so on about protecting biodiversity. But it's just about, if you kind of say, we will make this habitat hospitable to moths and lichen as well as to humans, it's just amazing, I think, to the developers and the municipal authorities how much positive response they get. It's not like asking people to do something they don't want to do. So in other words, offering vitality and conviviality to the more than human is not such a hard sell as it might sound. Not sure how clear that answer is, but basically don't hesitate to say it. We need to look after all of life and not just human life, full stop. And I think it's just amazing to me how many people will say, yes, of course we do. And not just kind of green people, but, people with iPads and Teslas, those sorts of people. So, yeah.
All right. Here's a message from Zeno Franchini, who's one of the co-heads of the Masters, who asks, in Europe, it seems the farming-related profession is less and less valued economically, and it seems EU policies do not really help that. How can we restore this value?
I mean, it's true. I mean, just in terms of numbers, it's quite shocking. Well, it varies tremendously. So I think in the UK, like 2% of the population works physically in farming, whereas in France, where I live, it's like 8%. But just in terms of mass numbers, there's a tremendous separation by itself. What I said before about the kind of strategy is to reframe the question about, it's not about the production of calories to feed 300 million people. It's about looking after the land, because 300 million people need somewhere healthy to live for their own welfare and well-being. And that looking after the land and the air and the water is a multidisciplinary activity. It requires everybody to contribute and participate in different ways. And at the end of the day, that's the title of my talk, is that we have to talk about health and care as the principal priorities that we have as a society. And then say, by the way, here are some practical consequences of that. So it's not just about being moralistic or idealistic. It's saying, we have to, if the health of our street outside our office is important to our health as people in this office, then what can we practically do to make the street healthier? And then you can then look at cleaning the street, planting things in it, trees, growing food, making mossy facades and so on. There's a lot of, 1,000,001 practical things you can do. So it's to do with not being defensive about the necessity for health to be a priority, but always try to say, and by the way, here's some small practical thing you can do, because people get very quickly fed up with being lectured about what things would be nice if they can't do anything about it.
We have 2 final questions, and so we're not taking any more. 7 o'clock already. From Oliver BLB Wright, he asks, states, thank you for your lecture, John. I'm curious about what success looks like for a care-based place. What would you measure, if anything?
Yeah, I think a care-based place wouldn't need to be measured is one criterion. So if it's care-based and successful, it means that people are doing a lot of things for each other without necessarily proving that they're doing the right thing. So that's one thing. If people are not obsessed by metrics, probably a healthy place, without underestimating the need to have metrics if you want anybody to pay for anything. And the other thing I think is, no, I'm going to leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Enough. Now, last question, which I really appreciate, from Maria del Carmen Ramirez Rosas, because I think it touches on something I'm also quite interested in it, which is, she says, thanks, John. I live in Ronco Scrivia, a small town where there is already a local agricultural network. Even if it is still quite small, we have dairy farms and vending machines that sell local animal products directly to the community. My question is, how can we strengthen and scale these small local systems so they don't remain isolated initiatives, but evolve into resilient territorial ecosystems? And I would add to that, how do we move beyond the notion of scaling up, this tendency we have, as you keep emphasizing, bringing it back to the local. But when we see it works, like what Maria's saying, how do we resist this tendency always to scale up, or must we? I think it's undesirable to think scale is the only measure of success. But on the other hand, it's one of the many things that's easy for people like me to say. I think that where I have observed local or regional economies getting stronger is when the conversations and the relationships between the different actors are supported and nourished. So, you have a great farmer who delivers milk to the milk vending machine. If she or he just drives in and out in a truck and doesn't have any other contact, that's a fragile relationship. But if, for example, the school has a relationship with that same farmer, and the children go out there, every now and again, and the farmer goes to the school, and you have a social as well as a kind of functional relationship. In other words, the farmer gets social value and kind of contact as well as just money for the milk. That's where you get these intangible and tangible benefits kind of being shared and multiplied. Multiplied, I think, is a better word than scaling. But therefore, I think when I said about village hosts, I think that the other thing I would say in a healthy place, which seems to be getting better all the time, is you have personal persons who are the connectors and the stewards and the hosts of that community. So they don't just wait for everything to happen by itself, but they, in one way or another, they say, dear farmer, do you want to go and talk to the people in the school? Dear office manager, would you like to have more butter from this guy, from, making connections that aren't going to be made by the existing kind of commercial relationships. I think it's something that can be done proactively by people, but the connecting person or the steward or the host needs to be paid or resourced as well. So that's the tricky bit. But when you have successful communities where that happens, is where there's, an activity called connecting people is done well and done with some, love and care. Great. No, beautiful. Challenging. Let me thank all the participants here, all the attendees. Thank you for your questions and for being here.
nice Thursday evening to listen to John, which has just been wonderful. And we do have some more collaborations in the future, as Sara mentioned, with Vivian Tauchman and Gabriel Fontana with workshops. But now I would like to thank John Thackara. Thank you so much for your time and insight and inspiration. He'll be with us tomorrow morning, but just with the master's students. So we're very lucky to have him, but thank you for speaking to the wider public. So thank you very much. Thank you all. Have a very good evening.